Welcome, I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. Voting in the New Zealand general election begins in 3 weeks. Are political parties' foreign policies the crucial forgotten element? Welcome, Robert.
Morning, Bruce.
Most New Zealanders seem to pay very little attention to the foreign policies of political parties when they're deciding how to vote. But does that matter? Does a government's foreign policy actually have any real impact on New Zealanders' lives?
Very much so. We live in an interconnected world, a world that's become increasingly interconnected through technology. And in addition, recent events have shown that New Zealand is not immune to trends which are occurring elsewhere. We saw the white supremacy movement has impacted on New Zealand in Christchurch during the atrocity of March 2019. We've also seen that we're not immune to global pandemics either. We've been deeply challenged, although we've done well with COVID-19. In addition, quite apart from the fact that we're connected to the rest of the world, we're a global trader. We trade with more than 100 countries, and 30% of New Zealand's GDP is earmarked for exports. So foreign policy is important, and the face that we present to the world to align with our interests is also important and should actually be a subject of more rigorous debate than it is.
What are the key differences between the foreign policies of the main political parties?
There doesn't seem to be huge differences. Both parties have been reticent so far to spell out their foreign policy visions. We know from Labour's track record, it's pledged, amongst other things, to complete a free trade agreement with the EU, which is the single biggest and most prosperous single market in the world. And we're also engaged with the British with free trade negotiations. I think National will be largely supportive of that. National and Labour share a commitment to international rules-based system. There might be a difference of emphasis, however, because I think National tend to, while they accept that, they tend to look more to the United States and China. In other words, they tend to be more enthusiastic about New Zealand's relations with great powers than perhaps the Ardern-led Labour government.
Which parties' policies would take us in a different direction to where we're going now, and what would the result of that be?
I think for the reasons I've just stated, there's a fair degree of overlap between Labour and National based on their track records. But I think the most radical new direction would be struck by some of the minor parties. The Green Party, for example, would wish to take New Zealand out of the intelligence sharing arrangement known as Five Eyes. And the ACT Party would like to see New Zealand build a free trade area involving Australia, Canada, and the other members of the Five Eyes except for the United States. So that's quite a radical shift. They put a big focus also on trade relations with the Commonwealth. The New Conservative Party is another minor party which would strike a radical posture in foreign policy. It would basically be very pro-Israel. It would want an embassy established immediately in Jerusalem. It would also wish essentially to oppose the Palestinian right to self-determination. It would create a fund so that the Palestinians' national aspirations could be met by existing Arab governments rather than a new territorial dispensation. So if you look at the 3 minor parties, they've got much more radical foreign policies than, or foreign policy initiatives than the major ones.
And once an election is held, then there's still that sort of horse trading to go on to work out a coalition government. Does foreign policy play a part in those discussions?
It hasn't too much in the past, Bruce, but that doesn't mean that that pattern will hold for the future. I think for the reasons we've gone through, both COVID-19 and the Christchurch atrocity, the terror atrocity in 2019, 2020 respectively, I think have alerted New Zealand how much we are connected to the world. And I think there are signs of partisanship growing over foreign policy. We've seen indicators of it. What I would say is that given the past convergence between the two major parties, that tends to limit the scope for horse trading. And the second point, which is related to that, is that the minor parties may have radical foreign policy initiatives in the pipeline, but if they want to become part of the government, they're often the junior partner. And New Zealand First, actually, when they formed a coalition with Jacinda Ardern's government, 2017, Mr. Peters wanted to be foreign minister, he became foreign minister, and he also wanted written into the coalition agreement the commitment towards what was called a Pacific reset. And that was implemented. So Mr. Peters was quite successful in, I think, projecting his foreign policy agenda at that time of changing, making New Zealand's policy much more committed to the Pacific and making it more robust, prepared to, if you like, confront China in the region. He's also boosted foreign affairs as a ministry, seen a big increase in funding for it, which I think in the long term is important for the country's interests. Going forward, it's difficult to know which party will, it looks like Labour may be the party that has the greatest number of seats. With regard to coalition partners, it's difficult to predict how much horse trading there'll be done. It seems that New Zealand First foreign policy has moved. They've indicated they want a harder line on immigration. And they're also working closely, of course, with people who've been formally identified with the Brexit campaign in the UK. And that has raised questions about how much New Zealand First is now committed to the rules-based international order, because the people who they're working with are basically trying to destroy the international rules-based order. So that does raise question marks about New Zealand's foreign policy direction in the future.
So Robert, what would you say is the most important foreign policy question for New Zealand going into the general election?
I think one of the most important issues, the core issue for New Zealand, is to maintain and strengthen the international rules-based system in which this country critically depends. Our national interests depend on international rules. And only in the last 7 days we've seen a very disturbing development where the Johnson government in the UK is proposing to renege on an international treaty, the withdrawal agreement that they signed in January with the EU. Now this is a very disquieting development because it raises questions for a country like New Zealand. We're in the process of negotiating a free trade agreement. Britain, at the moment, under the Johnson government, is proposing to renege on an agreement it's just made with 27 liberal democracies in the EU. That's bad news. How can we be confident that the Johnson government is going to honour any international agreement with us? So I think there's two steps that New Zealand parties or parties that are competing for power, we would like to hear from this election. Do they uphold the international rules-based order in which our national interest depends? And secondly, they should they not ask the British and tell them, actually, that it's unacceptable to break an international treaty. And that unless they take this into account, unless they pledge not to break that treaty, then that raises into question whether we should be signing a free trade agreement with a country which has demonstrated it will not necessarily honour an international agreement that it's signed.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Ka kite anō.